IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to yet another episode of All Things Policy, where we discuss policy issues of importance. So today we are going to talk about political instability that has been happening in Sri Lanka. The largely peaceful anti-government protests in Sri Lanka became violent earlier this week after the clashes between the supporters of the government and the protesters. And in the resulting violence, 9 people lost their lives, including 2 policemen. After the angry crowd burnt the Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa's ancestral home, he resigned and is now living in Trincomalee naval base. His brother, President Gotabaya, remains in power even as the protests continue with the slogans of #GoGotaGo. To discuss how the latest events in Sri Lanka impact India and what can New Delhi do in this situation, I am joined by Shrey Khanna, a staff research analyst with the Takshashila's Indo-Pacific program. Welcome, Shrey, to this episode.
Thank you, Priyal.
So now, directly diving into this topic, the first thing I want to ask you, Shrey, is what comes after the Rajpaksha family, and is this situation that is happening currently likely to normalize anytime soon?
Well, the ouster of Mahinda Rajapaksa and his resignation is an important event, not only in Sri Lankan politics, but also in the regional politics.
Right.
Here's a guy, he is dominating Sri Lankan politics since 2005-2006 when he became the president, and then his continuous rise, he was out of power in between. But his party continued to remain strong, and his family, as a result of it, became quite powerful.
Right.
His family members, they used to say that party is going to rule for next 20-30 years. They used to take a lot of inspiration from Chinese Communist Party, its developmental model, how it controls the politics in China. So that was all there in their political setup. But the economic collapse that has happened, and this was continuing since 2020, the balance of payment crisis, which came with the COVID-induced lockdown. There was, restrictions in tourism. It went down. And as a result of it, the forex that Sri Lanka was dependent on, it stopped coming. And then to restrict the outflow of forex reserve, the president, he came up with this idea and that we should, implement organic farming, banning all chemical fertilizers. So, and that led to this food crisis situation because the agricultural output came down. And so this situation was, it was heating up. There were food shortages in the country. And ultimately with Russia-Ukraine war in 2022, the commodity prices, they shot up. Yeah, and price of fuel, which Sri Lanka imports, it also gone up. It was also, there was so much inflationary pressure that there were this 10-hour power cuts and massive food shortages. And as a result of that, these protests against the government, they started and they were peaceful for quite some time. But what happened last week, that his supporters, they came from from villages to cities, and they fought with the protesters, and then protesters got better off them, and ultimately situation got so messed up that, like you mentioned in the intro, so many people died, including policemen. But I think Rajapaksa's departure is a positive development, not only for Sri Lanka, but for the whole subcontinent. However, the movement was not against Mahinda per se, but against the whole Rajapaksa family and its dominance in the Sri Lankan politics. So now today, new Prime Minister has come, Ranil Wickremesinghe. He is there, but Gotabaya Rajapaksa, he remains as the president. He has said that he will curtail the power of presidency, which has been an important issue in Sri Lankan politics. So he has promised it, but it's like a very weak kind of a promise. And protests, they continue. They demand that unless Gotabaya go and a unity government comes, they are likely to protest against. Because the thing with Vikram Singhe is that he's likely a spent force in Sri Lankan
Right.
politics. His party, he was head of its UNP, and then that major part of that party, it went on to become a new political party, SJB. And the last parliamentary elections, Vikram Singhe, he lost his seat. So he has no, much political legitimacy. Even now, there are reports that SJB has refused to send its member to the cabinet. There are, chief Catholic and Buddhist priests who are saying that we do not support Vikram Singhe as prime minister. So I think his appointment as the prime minister of the country, it has limited chances of restoring stability in the country.
Okay. That's actually really good information that you've provided, Shrey, because I mean, as a person who just follows the Sri Lanka crisis in Sri Lanka very on the surface level, this was very deep and extremely informative. Now, you also mentioned that, Rajapaksa's family sort of like leaving the position, Rajapaksa leaving the position of prime ministership is kind of good for Sri Lanka. But when we talk about India, right, what are the challenges that India faces with this continuous instability in its neighborhood? Because at the end of the day, Sri Lanka and India are neighbors, and we cannot deny that fact, right? So, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah. So the continued political and economic instability in India's immediate south has significant implications, I think, for its strategic interests. Firstly, if the
Right.
economic situation does not quickly stabilize, a massive influx of refugees in Tamil Nadu, it could
Hmm.
be very likely. And already India
Yeah.
hosts more than 100,000 refugees from Sri Lanka. And another wave of
Right.
migration, and these all Sri Lankan Tamils, they came during the civil war. And if another
Yeah.
wave of migration it happens, then there could be a humanitarian situation in the state. And there have been reports
Right.
that Sri Lankan Tamils, they are reaching the Tamil Nadu coast. So these dangers are growing by the day.
Yeah.
Secondly, the continued instability in Sri Lanka, it might also create a security problem for India, because there have
Right.
been a long standing linkages between islands Islamist groups
Hmm.
such as National Tawhid Jamaat with Pakistan based jihadi outfits like Lashkar-e-Toiba, and there have been ISI's involvement as well. And it was this Tawhid Jamaat which had carried out Easter attacks in April 2019, which led
Right.
to a ban on this organization. So if this political instability is there and migration is happening in Tamil Nadu, then there would be, the conditions would be quite conducive for such elements to cross into India and then undertake those kind of attacks, because South India, particularly Chennai, Bangalore, they have been on the targets of LET. There have been reports that they are funding radical Islam. So that is also one of the danger that may come up if political instability continues. However, I'll say that despite of all this, India's influence with this economic crisis going on, India's influence in the country, it has risen,
Hmm.
because India has provided around 3.5 billion in concessionary loans and lines of credit to Sri Lanka. And with this, the Rajapaksa government, which has been, a traditional China, pro-China family, China has funded their election campaigns allegedly. They had a very strong relationship, but because China refused to, provide that much help which Rajapaksa they wanted, and then India came in, and as a result of which, several Indian projects that were stuck in limbo, they
Hmm.
were cleared by the government. Recently, Sri Lanka also signed two maritime security pacts with India to
Nice.
install coastal radar systems and operate a floating dock facility provided by India. So, collapse of the dominance of Rajapaksa family would offer both opportunities and challenges to India to safeguard its strategic interests in the country. And the growing trend of strong bilateral relationship is likely to continue with the appointment of Ranil Wickremesinghe as the new prime minister, because he is known to be a kind of a pro-India personality. This means that China's influence to halt the progress of India's economic projects, it will be curtailed. But how that will pan out, it depends on the political stability. If Ranil is successful in,
Right. Yeah.
creating a stable cabinet.
Okay. Yeah, that's actually very interesting how, at the time of crisis, because of India's help, things have turned also better for India, right? Now, before we move on, we would like to take a short break and we'll continue once we are back, we will continue talking about this topic.
Hello, everybody. It's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Cyrus Says His Cock and Bull, Cyrus, Naveen, Vagda, and Antriksh talk about the American mother who was arrested because her kid took marijuana-laced gummies to school. Vagda is a co-host for our show Press Decode, so if you haven't been checking that out, check her out on that show as well as this one. The Simplified Gang explore Mumbai through Naren's stories and observations. On All Things Policies, the Takshashila folk discuss the U.S. Supreme Court's potential decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. On the Life Manifesto, Zarina introduces us to Don Miguel Ruiz's 4 Agreements of Life. And on Hansavani, hear the story Nai Idga. It explores the role of media amidst a state of religious animosity in our country. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. On LinkedIn, we've been doing a series of profiles of people within the office, so do check that out for sure. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Also, don't forget to rate us on any platforms you're listening on. And you can also check us out on YouTube. We have a page on our website, ivmpodcast.com/YouTube, with a list of all our channels. We're also doing a small listener survey to better understand how you, the listener, responds to the advertising on our network. And also, we just want to know a little bit more about you. We would really appreciate it if you could spare a few minutes to fill it out. It will really help us build some better shows for you. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors on the network this week, SBI Life Insurance and Jupiter, a digital banking app.
Hello and welcome back to today's episode. Where we are discussing about the political instability in Sri Lanka. And as of now, we've talked about what exactly is the situation and if it's going to come to normal anytime soon, and what are the challenges that India faces with the continuing instability that is happening in its neighborhood. Now, continuing with that line of conversation, Shrey, you mentioned during the second point that how during this entire time with this, because India has shown tremendous support to Sri Lanka in giving them loans and stuff, how things have turned into our favor and how it has it's helping in strengthening our relationship with Sri Lanka and how it's sort of like diminishing China's influence in Sri Lanka's political climate. So to continue with that, what can India do to sort of support the democracy in Sri Lanka?
So, democracy is obviously, Sri Lanka has a strong, democratic credentials. They have free press, and because of this, we see the kind of protests they're the kind of historic protests that are leading to the resignation of Mahinda Rajapaksa and likely Gotabaya as well in future. So that process is there in Sri Lanka. How India can support is that, first of all, there are, calls for military intervention in Sri Lanka. There have been, prominent MP and politicians are saying that India should, military intervene, like during Indira Gandhi's tenure when India had intervened to crush leftist insurgency in Sri Lanka. But I think these kind of views, they are mistaken, because if India, decides to intervene, then this would be seen as an affront to Sri Lankan sovereignty, that how India is, invading Sri Lanka again. And this is also an important touching point for Sri Lankans already. So it is not a wisely move. And we see right now, there is an active India Out campaign going on in Maldives, where they are saying that the opposition, it is saying that India's prominence in country affairs, it will lead to, Indian boots on the ground, and India is gaining military advantages in the country. So we have to keep the India out. And this sort of activity, if India undertakes, I think it's very unlikely. As Indian High Commission in Sri Lanka has said that these all reports are all rumors, and India is not going to do any such of activity, which is a wise move. So that is not happening. But I think there is no need for such sort of calls for military intervention. India should push for an all-party government, particularly if this Vikram Singhe experiment fails, which I do not see how it will succeed. but we can't be sure about this. It's like a developing situation. But if this Vikram Singhe experiment fails, then India should push for an all-party government, and then some kind of a political stability can happen, because we have to remember that all economic stability is dependent on political stability. Recently, even the governor of Central Bank of Sri Lanka, he said that political instability in the country, it could result in worsening of the existing economic crisis in Sri Lanka. So political instability is very detrimental to the economic situation that is there in Sri Lanka. So I think first thing that needs to happen is like a political settlement, and India has the influence, and it should play, behind the scenes conciliator of different political factions, and see if there can be an umbrella government or a unity government which can be formed to tide away from this crisis.
Right. That's actually these are some really interesting points. And I think what caught my attention was the fact that you said political stability is very important for the economic stability. And that's actually really, really true. So yeah, thank you so much, Shrey, for joining me at this episode and telling me as well as the listener so much about what exactly is happening, giving us a broad overview about what exactly is happening in Sri Lanka and the things that could be improved in the future. So thank you so much for joining me, and for all our listeners, thank you for listening. We'll be back with the next episode soon.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST. or our website, takshashila.org.in.
There's a quick survey to fill out on ivmpodcast.com/survey. It lets us know a little bit more about who's listening to us. And you know what? We're going to do a few prizes. So, we'll do a random drawing of maybe 10 people, and we'll send you all some swag. Remember, that's ivmpodcast.com/survey where you can fill out the survey.
Ladies, I'm sure you will relate to it if I say that we are constantly busy with work, studies, cooking, and what not. And amidst all of this, we often forget an important element that needs our desperate attention: finance. So here we are, bringing to you SBI Life presents A Sip of Finance, a women-exclusive podcast where we will teach you how to manage personal finances in a simple and straightforward way with your host, Priyanka Acharya, a finance expert who's been in the industry for 14 plus years. And not just in English, but in 7 more languages. So tune in every Tuesday for fresh episodes on the IVM Podcast Network and all major podcast streaming platforms.